did it! You fought for it, you voted for it, and now it has arrived. Change begins now.
In the last few days, Britain has a new government, and it seems our special relationship with America remains intact.
This is the White House Situation Room, getting to connect Prime Minister Starmer to President Biden. You are now connected to Air Force One.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Prime Minister, congratulations. What a hell of a victory. Congratulations.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's been a long night and day.
Labour is back in power for the first time in 14 years, under the leadership of barrister and former head of the Crown Prosecution Service, Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Labour swept to an historic victory, securing 411 seats, leaving the Conservative Party decimated with 121, and a dejected, somewhat repentant Rishi Sunak speaking outside Number 10 for the last time as PM.
To the country, I would like to say first and foremost, I am sorry. I have given this job my all, but you have sent a clear signal that the government of the United Kingdom must change.
The Lib Dems had a record-breaking night, gaining 61 seats. The Scottish National Party virtually collapsed, and Nigel Farage's Reform were jubilant, securing 4 million votes and 5 seats in the House. So for this week's Convex Conversation with me, broadcaster Helen Fospero, I'm delighted to have Tim Shipman, political insider and award-winning chief political commentator for the Sunday Times, to assess where we're at and what lies ahead. Tim has been observing and writing about each twist and turn in the corridors of power for a very long time, seemingly taking readers inside every room and being party to what seems like every conversation. His weekly column, featuring his trademark wit and wisdom, is awaited with the same eagerness as the Ton awaits the latest instalment from Lady Whistledown in the Netflix drama Bridgerton. Tim's hotly anticipated third instalment in his gripping sequence of 4 books, No Way Out, has just hit bookshelves, covering the last 6 or 7 years at Westminster. Following on from his bestsellers All Out War and Fallout, No Way Out offers an unflinching, unfiltered account of some of the most turbulent years of British politics, including, of course, Brexit. Tim, it's fantastic to meet you. July the 4th has been and gone, and I was rather impressed to learn you managed a festival the weekend after.
Yeah, that was one I agreed to do before I realised we were going to have just finished a general election and that I was going to have to add another 40 pages to my 4th book, which is coming out in September. So I've been juggling live events quite a lot and 2 small children. And but it's great to be here.
And are you a bit tired?
Bit worn out, a bit jaded about the gills, a bit like the country, really, and hoping for a bright future.
Oh, yes, we absolutely are. Now, how was this election for you?
It was a lot more interesting than I thought it was going to be, actually. I mean, the result was a little bit preordained, but the campaign was sort of riven with controversy and gaffes and the kind of stuff that gets journalists out of bed in the morning. So it could have been a lot worse. And there were a couple of moments where the Tories closed the gap a little bit and then they sort of blew it up for themselves. And the way in which Rishi Sunak did so, I think, was sort of emblematic of some of the mistakes he's made and some of the mistakes others have made over the years. So there was plenty to chew on, and Liz Truss losing her seat right at the end as dawn broke is not a bad conclusion to the 4th book.
I didn't feel she was very gracious in losing. Didn't she blame Labour's immigration policy of 14 years ago for her loss?
Well, she didn't say a great deal on the night at all. I mean, she was sort of slow hand-clapped to the podium, and then they announced the result. And everybody sort of turned to her, given that she'd been MP where she was in Norfolk for sort of 20-odd years and had been Prime Minister. I think most people thought she might say a few words at that point. And she turned turkey and strolled off, claimed later that, she didn't have the opportunity to speak. Well, I think if you're a former Prime Minister, you can pretty much make the opportunity. Lots of other people who lost managed to have their say. So, yes, there's always a post hoc analysis of these things. One of the things that brings together Theresa May, Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, I think, is a general view that it wasn't really their fault that things went wrong for them. Rishi Sunak seems to be following the path of self-flagellation a little bit more successfully at the moment.
Rory Stewart, who was on our podcast recently, called it a loveless landslide. A Labour victory, I'm sure, looked certain. But what did you make of the size of it and the message that Britain sent on election night?
I think it is a wide and slightly shallower landslide than we expected. 35% of the vote is not vast. It's less than David Cameron got in 2010 when he didn't get a majority at all. And it's a function of the right splitting, the Tories and Reform thrashing it out over the same voters, in the same way that Margaret Thatcher's landslides were slightly the consequence of the SDP breaking away from the Labour Party. And in those days, the left was split, now the right's split. But you play the game that's in front of you. And some of Jeremy Corbyn's supporters have been saying, well, Keir Starmer didn't get as many votes as Jeremy Corbyn. No, but Jeremy Corbyn piled them up in seats that Labour was always going to win. And what Keir Starmer and his chief strategist, Morgan McSweeney, have got right over the last couple of years is that they've managed to get people voting for them in places that haven't voted for them for a long time. And they stacked up votes in marginal seats. That's the game, and they won it. And no one looks back on Margaret Thatcher and says, she was an illegitimate prime minister and she was going to be out on her ear just because her majorities were partly bequeathed to her by the SDP. And I suspect history will say this was a good job.
It feels as if the nation swung a wrecking ball at the Tories in many ways, with a lot of people feeling disillusioned and perhaps let down. What factors and which characters were to blame, do you think, and were at the heart of this crushing defeat? And I'm guessing that answer could actually fill a podcast on its own.
Yeah, we could be still here 2 hours later as I read out the conclusions of each of my recent books. Look, they're all to blame to a degree. I mean, my personal view is that Boris Johnson kind of torched his own brand with all the Partygate stuff. That kind of contributed to the notion that the Tories were happy to break their own rules and that they were a sort of unseemly mess. I think Liz Truss more emphatically blew up the core Tory brand even than Boris Johnson did with her mini budget, which it exploded in her premiership in the space of 6 or 7 weeks. And the one thing the Tories normally have is the sort of middling voter might say to themselves, well, I don't much like them, but they are at least competent and they're not going to pour the money down the drain. And unfortunately for the Tories, Liz Truss kind of comprehensively did just that. Rishi Sunak then came in and he was obviously on a very sticky wicket and very kind of, up against it to try and turn things around. But I think people would say that to start with, he kind of got his head down and did a few effective things like the Windsor framework on Northern Ireland, which kind of ironed out a lot of the problems over there with Brexit. That was a good bit of work, and dependent on Sunak being, a details man, getting into the weeds. And he believed he could win the election by pootling along, administrating well, but not really having much of a political strategy or any kind of great vision for the future. And attempts by his staff to make him focus on that were resisted heartily by Sunak. He didn't like the big talk. He was a fixer, a problem solver, a man who likes to stare at a problem until the solution presents itself. And in that regard, he was a little bit similar to Theresa May, and they both failed because, politics is about more than that. It's about working out a big strategic goal. It's about finding the tactics to get yourself there, and it's about having the ability to go there yourself and the communication skills, crucially, to take others with you. And I think May and Sunak both lacked that. And by the time he realised that he wasn't getting anywhere, Sunak's attempts to have a political strategy, if you think back to the party conference last year when he tried to present himself after 13 years of Conservative rule as the change candidate, and his idea of change was really a sort of weird collection of things that he was quite enthusiastic about: getting rid of the second leg of HS2, getting rid of smoking, getting rid of A-levels. Okay, fine. But replacing them with what? He came up with this phrase, the Great British Standard, as if that was sort of something that was going to be, a sexy name for a new exam. You just need a bit of help with the branding here, mate. And he seemed to resist any attempts to come up with a sort of grand vision and to say, as George Osborne and David Cameron did when they came in as austerity, their view was tell the country this is going to be hard for a bit. In their case, debt was too high and all the rest of it. We're going to cut off the money for a while and we're going to get everything back in order. But at the end of it, there are these great prizes. And if you take some sacrifice now, there'll be a bounty in future. And Sunak really just went on and on about the economy and immigration and said, I'm going to solve these problems. And then he didn't. So even in his own terms, he failed. He failed to deliver, which was supposed to be the one thing he was going to do. And he didn't seem to acknowledge that just delivering even wouldn't be enough, that you needed to sell a vision of the future. And in the end, Starmer was very cautious. And I think a lot of people on his side would say he didn't particularly do that effectively. But the Tories had so torched themselves that if it was a victory by default, you still have to be in a position, you still have to look like a credible government in waiting. And Starmer managed to do that.
One thing that really puzzled me, and I feel I can ask you this, Tim, is that Rishi always made a big thing about the fact he's the son of immigrants and has had opportunities in Britain. And he said only a week or two ago that the pleasure it gave him to see his children in Downing Street with Diwali candles. I didn't quite understand where Rwanda came in and what he's thinking behind that. For me personally, and I do speak just personally, I felt the whole thing was really distasteful and didn't understand where that was coming from as somebody who clearly appreciates his background.
Yeah, look, illegal migration has become a big political issue. It often is. It's very visible in the form of the small boats. The Rwanda solution was one that Boris Johnson, Suella Braverman and Liz Truss dreamt up when Johnson was Prime Minister. So Sunak had a big decision to make when he came in. Did he continue to go with that? Now, a lot of the voters that they thought they needed to hold on to, the people who did end up voting for a reform, care passionately about this issue. Their view was it would have a deterrent effect and they needed to press on with it. I think my argument would be, whether or not it is distasteful, and clearly lots of people found it so, the only way you can then justify it is to make it work. And he ended up with a scheme that alienated a lot of those voters who probably in the South switched to voting for the Liberal Democrats or stayed at home. And in the North, people in those red wall seats or people who were looking at voting for reform said, has this bloke done what he said he was going to do? And he hasn't. So he mucked about. He had a distasteful policy, but one that he didn't pursue with its full vigour. He thought, well, we'll pass this law and that might be enough. And if it's not enough, we'll try something else. But he used up an inordinate amount of time in so doing. And consequently, he got to an election. He decided to snap call an election before a single plane had taken off for Rwanda. And he must have at that point suspected that there'd be some kind of problem in the courts and it would force him to make a decision about whether he was going to ignore a European court ruling, as he said he would. But this was a failure of sort of mood and tone for some voters, and it was a failure of delivery for others. So it didn't work in either regard. And whatever you think of it, the Rwanda thing has failed. Now, that doesn't mean that when Starmer scraps it, it won't release a deterrent effect. I mean, a lot of people in the Home Office will tell you that this is going to be the biggest season of small boat arrivals that we've ever seen, because there's been a lot of people stuck in France waiting for their moment. And the French police are sort of turfing everyone out of Paris for the Olympics. And with the right doing quite well in France, it seems unlikely that the French will be quite so rigorous about rounding up migrants and stopping them coming to Britain. So this could be a big moment for Starmer. But the flip side of it, of course, is legal migration, which has also been soaring. To a degree, that was because we were generous in allowing lots of people from Hong Kong, from Ukraine and from other parts of the Middle East to come in. But Sunak resisted attempts by Robert Jenrick, his former immigration minister, to tighten up the rules. Ironically, it was Boris Johnson that lowered the salary threshold you needed to come in. And the great story of the post-Brexit period is that while we ended free movement from Europe, we opened it up for anyone who could earn 25 grand from the rest of the world. And as a consequence, the numbers have gone soaring. Had Sunak dealt with that, he might have been given more of a pass on the small boats. But because he dealt with neither, the headline figures were absolutely colossal. And the focus was on this thing that a lot of political energy and noise had been made about. And in the end, it didn't work.
We are only 10 days or so in, but what are your first impressions of Keir Starmer, how he's been and the new government?
How he's been, I mean, looking at him, I think he looks more relaxed now than he did when he was the leader of the opposition. There was this joke about he was the sort of Ming vase strategy of cautiously carrying an expensive vase across the slippery floor and hoping just to get to the other side. And it felt a little bit that's what Starmer's period as leader of the opposition was like. He's a sort of natural kind of head honcho for a big organisation. He's done that before. I suspect he will have already have been pretty gobsmacked by the speed and volume of events and decisions that come at you, which is not something anything can prepare you for, certainly not being leader of the CPS. But I think he's sort of comfortable with power, and I think he'll get his head down. A lot of the stuff that they've done so far is stuff they would have planned already. We kind of knew what the first few weeks were going to look like. This week he's been to the NATO summit. He's about to chair the European Political Community meeting, which is a sort of the EU plus other European countries, which seems like a natural resting place for Britain, really, as a kind of outer circle, not in the EU, but collaborating with them in various regards. In both of those meetings, the sort of security context of Putin and Ukraine is uppermost in people's minds. So all that's planned. I think the challenge for Keir Starmer will be when stuff happens that he's not expected. And what he looked like in opposition in those circumstances was that he would have his instincts and he would kind of make a decision, and then he'd be confronted by evidence that wasn't perhaps the right way to go, and that there would be some sort of U-turn or change might be in order, looking at the focus groups, the polling, the contentious nature of things within his own party. And he showed himself very willing to change course. I think he's a kind of centre-left instincts, but with a willingness to override them with a sort of pragmatic approach. And that's kind of the story of his leadership. The first couple of years were more about those left-wing instincts. And then after the Hartlepool by-election in 2021, when he lost and considered resigning, I think he took a decision then to pitch himself much more to the centre. The challenge is, when events come at you really fast, do you fall back on those instincts, or do you listen to your aides who say, practically, Prime Minister, this is what we need to do? And more importantly, can you do that quickly? Can Starmer pivot to the right answer quickly enough? Or is that a process that's going to take days or weeks and we'll be in for a bunch of U-turns? Now, Prime Ministers always U-turn, the sensible ones anyway, because that's how you avoid driving into the wall. But I think that will be the interesting thing for me, to see how Starmer copes with what Macmillan famously called events, dear boy.
Events, dear boy. Well, when events do happen, I'm just wondering how much experience you think Keir might be able to draw on as he gets comfortable at Downing Street. Is he just a phone call away from two former Labour Prime Ministers and two very experienced former directors of communications in Peter Mandelson and Alastair Campbell?
Yes, those people are all on the end of a phone. Some of them he would phone, some of them would phone him. I think, most of the Labour comms operation regard Peter Mandelson particularly as a sort of god figure and are closely in touch with them. Morgan McSweeney, the chief strategist, is someone who talks to Mandelson quite a lot. Alastair Campbell is always willing to offer his views. I think there'll be people in the comms team who will talk to him, though I sense he's not perhaps as plugged in as Mandelson is. Of the two Prime Ministers, Blair will offer his views, as he did on the front page of the Sunday Times last weekend, as he does through his institute. He's got a lot of clever people working for him. Some of whom are now going into government. So Blair has quite a bit of influence, and he's someone who's been there and done that. Starmer will not be frightened of picking up the phone. Gordon Brown is someone who picks up the phone. So whether or not you wish to speak to Gordon will be speaking to you and telling you his thoughts. In the early stages of the Starmer leadership, of course, Brown had to be basically recruited to go off and work out how to save the union, because that was the best way of keeping him occupied and not picking up the phone on everything else. And he came away with a sort of idea of a Senate of the nations and all this kind of thing. But yes, particularly if things get sticky economically, Gordon will be stating his views. I'm being a little bit unkind. I'm sure Starmer is happy to speak to him, but perhaps not as often as Gordon would like to speak to him.
I wish he'd ring me. I've been trying to do a podcast with him on his multi-bank scheme, which I really admire. And so, Gordon, if you're listening to this, please pick up the phone, because I am keen to do it. What about Victoria Starmer? Sir Keir's wife, Lady Victoria, has kept a very low profile in the campaign. Will she stay out of the spotlight now, or in that kind of almost first lady role, if you like, will she take a bigger piece of the action?
She would like to stay out of the spotlight. I think a lot of prime ministerial spouses want that. I think that is very difficult in the modern age, because you're not just selling political ideas, you're selling a person, and the context of that person is their family. Now, the Starmers have been very good about not talking about their children. Starmer's talked a bit about how he fears for his children, both of whom are teenagers, 13 and 15. He doesn't talk about their names, and the media doesn't then print their names. The kids will probably be more protected and secluded than any kids I can think of in recent memory. There won't be pictures with them. If there are, that something's going fairly badly wrong for Labour and they're trying to create a sort of image of a cosy first family. She is not happy to have anything to do with this. She's not interested in living in Downing Street, but all Prime Ministers' families are told that they must for security reasons. And the interesting thing about Liz Truss's memoir, while a lot of it's not terribly self-aware, the stuff about living in Number 10 is actually rather powerful, about the sort of goldfish bowl. Even getting out to do the shopping is a problem, and getting Deliveroo to come in is also a problem. They're like, oh, you're winding me up. This can't possibly be for 10 Downing Street. So that's all very difficult, and I'm sure she'll find that frustrating. Now, people who are determined to will get out and run around the park and go off and see their old friends, but gradually I suspect she'll be sucked into doing some kind of front of house spousal stuff. It'd be interesting to see with all these summits coming up whether she takes part. There's normally a spousal programme. It's quite difficult to dodge that. And eventually what most wives, they're normally wives, not always, of course, we've had a few political husbands along the way. What most spouses find is that they do actually have a platform and there are things they care about. And the best way to look like you're kind of contributing something is to take on a couple of issues and quietly work away at those, help some charities for things that you care about, invite a few people into number 10 to get greater prominence for something that you're interested in. And I think that gives people something to do. It makes people think that they're doing something worthwhile and useful. And I think it keeps the sort of media gently off your back as well, lest they be unkind about sitting there on taxpayers' money. What are you actually doing about it? Now, I suspect she will try harder than anyone since Cherie Booth, Blair's wife, to really stay out of it and remain her own woman. But even Cherie was dragged in eventually. So I wouldn't want to predict what timescale we'll see them. But she's obviously been at her husband's side, having a picture taken at his moments of triumph. Eventually, it's normal to get some advice and some help. She'll probably get some help with her clothes and help with her hair and all that kind of stuff, because if you're constantly on display, it's quite wearing to have to worry about all that sort of thing yourself. But I suspect she'll find some issues and some things she cares about, and at some point we'll quietly hear about them. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that she'll do interviews about them. That would depend how much more relaxed she'd become about it. But my understanding is she's very unkeen to do any of that kind of stuff. But most people get gently dragged into it in the end.
Gently dragged in. After the political uncertainty of the last few years, that's putting it mildly, really, isn't it? It's the chaos of the last few years. One would hope, as Rachel Reeves says, that it's time to unite. I think she said that Labour will put the nation first and the party second. But Nigel Farage, I don't think of Reform sees it that way. I think his rhetoric was, we're coming after Labour. How different will it feel with Reform now having 5 seats? And actually, it's a surprise they're not more, because he did get more than 4 million of the votes, didn't he? So if we were doing proportional representation, one would have thought that would be more seats.
Well, UKIP got 4 million votes as well and got 1 seat. And the only seat they got was Carswell, who'd held that seat previously for the Tories. And yeah, it's not a fair system. I mean, my personal view is it's quite a good system, that it gives people the ability to actually govern, and that the alternative is a sort of smorgasbord mess of governments that are constantly reforming. Basically a repeat of the last 8 years, but forever, with things falling apart and alliances being redrawn and reformed. And it also gives outsized influence to the more extreme ends of the political spectrum, I think, if you have PR. And this is a country not used to that. I guess there are countries that are very used to it and it works differently. But ours is such a confrontational system that I think it would take quite a lot of adapting to. And if you look at that Brexit period, which I've spent so much time writing about, when Theresa May had no majority, there were sort of reasonable positions that might have been struck at the start of her premiership. By the end, the only 2 really viable positions on Brexit were, are we going to leave with no deal, or are we going to rejoin the EU? And the whole middle ground had been hollowed out by events. And I think there's a danger that you would get a sort of Corbynite left party and a sort of even more strident version of Reform on the right, trying to wag the collective dog. And I don't think that's a terribly good idea personally. But what will the effect of Farage be? I mean, I think it's important that they actually did win some seats from the Labour Party and that they're now second in 98 seats. And I think it means that it will be something that Starmer has to think about in the same way it's something the Tories had to think about and still have to think about. The Conservative Party needs to decide whether it wants to run after those Reform voters who took 2 seats from them, or think about the seats they lost to the Labour Party or to the Liberal Democrats, and work out which of those is more important. I think we know what a lot of them will try to do, which is say we weren't nearly Conservative enough. The interesting thing with what's left in the Conservative Party is that quite a large proportion of the 121 MPs they've got are actually the sort of one nation left of the party. They were the ones in the safer seats. So that will affect what happens to them. But yes, Starmer's going to have to look over his shoulder at Reform. And I would be surprised if it didn't affect some of his thinking around migration. And I'd be surprised if it didn't affect some of his thinking around what he does next with the EU. It's pretty clear that he wants a better trading working relationship, but the EU has demands of its own, one of which is youth or sexual mobility deals to allow people between 18 and 30 to come in almost unlimited for 4 years if they've got a job or a place of study, and bring in all their dependents. Well, that's going to cut across existing immigration rules, and it's going to cut potentially across what Starmer wants to do. And if he wants to cling on to those voters or resist reform, it's possible that will affect how he does things. If he's sensible, he'll work out where his coalition is and try and do it. If you actually look at the results of the election, it's very interesting. They distributed the vote much better. Labour vote went down in areas among the less well-off voter, because a lot of them did switch to reform. But it went up in areas that Labour has struggled to win for the last sort of 15 years. So McSweeney and Starmer were prepared to take a hit in some of those places. And it may just be that Labour think, well, if we're going to establish ourselves as a government that's going to go for 2 or 3 terms, we might have to accept that we lose a few more of those Teesside seats or bits of the northeast or the northwest or all the seats in the Midlands that have begun to vote for kind of pro-Palestinian candidates. And instead of trying to grab them all back, they might say, well, we'll keep what we've got, thank you very much, and maybe even make some further gains in Conservative-facing seats. It's going to be difficult given the shallowness of the win and the fact that the average majority now it used to be up over 10,000, it's now about 6,500. So seats are generally just much more marginal than they were, and you can expect a large number of them to change hands at the next election, regardless of what Starmer does. But he's going to be looking over his shoulder at reform. The interesting thing will be to see how much he lets that affect what he's going to do. If he's after those votes, I think it will have to affect what he's going to do. But he may just decide that there's more votes to be gained elsewhere, and that Labour just has to accept the loss of some of those northern working class communities to Farage.
We might be entering perhaps a calmer time, but oh my goodness, your job, Tim, is just always interesting. And I wanted to ask you a bit about the fact that you do have a very good reputation as always knowing the inside information. Give us a sense of what the secret is to having such insight behind the scenes. And I'm wondering whether it involves some long lunches over some nice red wine, or whether it's a case of really building your contacts and nurturing them over a long time, building trust.
Well, look, when you're starting out in life and people are talking about the cynical place of work, they always say it's not what you know, it's who you know. And that's intimidating when you're starting out, when you don't know anybody. And I didn't. I had no contacts in journalism or in politics. But I played a long game, and the peak period of my career did not come until I was nearly 40. Lots of people these days blaze a trail and are political editors at 28 and making a great name for themselves all over social media in their mid-20s often. And that's great. It took a lot longer for me when I was starting out. I was working for newspapers, and the political editor wrote the best stories and the deputy political editor wrote the next best stories, and on down the train. And you had to develop contacts to get in the newspaper. You had to get in with people on various select committees. You'd then get in with new MPs, with junior ministers, and really you all kind of rise together. By the time I was a political editor at the Sunday Times, I was sort of 38, and I was then in a kind of peak position to take advantage of all the chaos that has subsequently followed. And yeah, policemen, spies and journalists are all in the same game. We're all basically about recruiting contacts. If I think of it in spy terms, members of the cabinet, ministers, special advisors, these are all sub-agents of my network, and you got to treat them right. What I've tried to establish with the books particularly is to give everyone a fair shake and try to explain what they're thinking and why they're doing what they're doing, rather than say this is wrong or this is stupid. And as a result, people will come to me and trust me with their thoughts because they know I'm not going to make them look stupid. There's a sort of lot of mutual benefit to be had between the media and politicians. We get interviews and we get space and we get stories, and they get a chance to put their message across. And that can sometimes look a bit cozy from the outside, but it is something that you have to work at. And I think trust is the most important thing. I need to be able to have conversations with people where they know that if they say something interesting to me, I'm not going to necessarily rush off and write that immediately. I might say, well, that's interesting, but where's that going to lead? Is that leading to some new announcement? And they'll say, yes, but it's in 2 months, so don't write it now. But when the time comes, you can have the story. And so you need to be prepared to do that. A lot of younger folk rush off and blow everything up, and then no one speaks to them again. You can have a very successful career in politics that lasts 3 or 4 years doing that. You turn over literally everybody in your path. But that's not how I've played it, and that's why at the age of 49, I'm still going. And hopefully my reputation's good enough that, I know a lot of these people at the top of the new government who were starting out in politics at the same time I was. They're people who came in 2001, 2005, 2010, who I've known since they were just starting out. Some of them are now senior people in the shadow cabinet. There are advisors, there are very few who were in the last Labour government, but some of the people who were special advisors in the last government are now cabinet ministers. Yes, it's a sort of process of a cultivation, and it's shocking to reveal, but from time to time that does involve breaking bread with people or even opening a bottle of wine. Though I would say that happens a good deal less often than it used to. I don't do that many lunches with ministers anymore because invariably they get cancelled. There's always something more important to do than talk to a journalist. But I get people to say, look, can I pop in for a coffee? And with these new ministers, the ones I don't know so well, I will try and get to know and just develop a relationship with them. And in due course, they might find it useful to speak to me about something. And in due course, I might be writing about something and say, look, this is your patch. Why don't we do some business here? And it becomes of mutual benefit. My goal is to serve the reader by finding out as much as I can and telling them as much as I can. And the way I've done that is to try to nurture these relationships. Other people do it differently. Some people stare at bits of paper and find out stories that way. Other people perform a sort of hit and run operation. And my way is a bit different. And I think that most of the successful journalists I've admired over the years have done it the way I've done it. There was one, a very prominent Sunday journalist who literally turned over everybody every week, phoned up to apologise on the Monday, and some of them still had relationships with him thereafter. That takes quite a lot of chutzpah and quite a lot of emotional energy that I don't have. So there are other ways, but I think this is the one that your average agent runner in a spy agency would do, and it's certainly the best one that's worked for me journalistically.
I've waited for a long time, Tim, for a tap on the shoulder from MI5. I love the idea of being a spy. But just, well, we've mentioned spies twice. You're quite fascinated by that world, aren't you? And also potentially writing in that world.
Yeah, when I was at Cambridge, I did an intelligence history course with Christopher Andrew, who went on to become the official historian of MI5. And through him, I met some double agents and all the rest of it. And I did my master's thesis with him as well. And after 2 years of working together, I said, come on, Chris, we've been working together 2 years. I've even taught your course to people 1 year younger than myself, such is the way at Cambridge. And he said, Tim, I would no more recruit you than I would recruit my bedder. Now, that's a reference to someone who changes your sheets and pillowcases and all the rest of it. He said, you're far too indiscreet. Go and be a journalist. So I took great delight in my first book in sticking him in the acknowledgements, and I ran into him a little while ago, and he seemed happy with the advice he'd given me. But yes, recreationally, one of my fascinations is spy fiction, and I've read a lot of it, and I did a big list on the top authors for a group called Spybury, which is full of authors and readers of this stuff. So I've acquired a status as a sort of minor influencer on this. So I get sent a lot of books now, and I've been lucky enough as a result of that to interview quite a lot of top authors for the Sunday Times as well, for the culture pages, Mick Herron, Joseph Cannon, David McCloskey, who's the bright new star, the ex-CIA guy who's written a couple, and I've got his third one in proof next to me now, and he's blazing a trail. But yes, my plan was always to write fiction. I got my literary agent to write fiction, and then within the next 3 weeks, I'll have completed 4 books, about 2,800 pages and about 1.1 million words of non-fiction politics. And to be honest, I've about had enough of reality. So I've got a couple of publishers interested in me having a crack at a novel. So I will probably do that next.
I do love Mick Herron and people like Robert Harris, and obviously Slow Horses was incredible. The drama I thought was excellent on the TV. To me, it was just as it was on the page.
Exactly. I mean, it's one of those rare things where the people who love the books actually really love the TV series as well. And Mick is a wonderful chap. I've got to know him reasonably well, and he's one of the most humble people you'll ever meet, but he's created a quite phenomenal kind of universe there, which if anyone hasn't read them, they should go and give those a whirl.
Absolutely super. And I'm trying to think of the lead character.
Jackson Lamb.
Yes, but Jackson Lamb, who played him?
Oh, Gary Oldman.
Gary Oldman played him exactly. Well, all of the characters were absolutely brilliant. We must get on to your books, because your new book has just come out, No Way Out. You've got your fourth and final one in this series coming out in September. This one covers about 6 or 7 years, doesn't it? And it's taken you longer to write than the first two.
Well, it took sort of 6 or 7 years to write. Basically, it was supposed to be one book to conclude the trilogy, but I ended up writing about 1,600 pages. So at some point, HarperCollins decided, rather than just butcher it, because my thing is the sort of detail and getting into the weeds and getting you in the room and telling you what really happened, they consented to publish 2 books. So book 3, No Way Out, which is on the streets now, is basically the story of Theresa May from the end of 2017 until she goes, and includes the Boris Johnson victory in the 2019 leadership contest, which is suitably chaotic and paves the way nicely for what comes next. And book 4 is basically Johnson, Truss and Sunak, ending with the election. So that's what I'm kind of writing at the moment. But yeah, it's just a period of enormous turbulence. And that May book that's out now, people might remember that as a deeply traumatic time, but there's a lot lot of new material in this book. And I think the debates, particularly between May and Parliament, and the efforts made to try and push her deal through, are one of the great sort of parliamentary moments probably since the Second World War. And while it wasn't all fun to write and it's not all fun to read, there's quite a lot of new material there. I always try to look at the humorous side of things and the human side of things. And so it's not just an endless recitation of boring Brexit votes. There's a lot of psychology in there. There's a lot of plotting. And there's lots and lots of people, ministers, special advisors, people in the commission in Brussels, all sitting in a room with Theresa May and not one of them really knowing what she thought about anything. She gave nothing away, which makes her very intriguing to write about, trying to work out what she thought. And yeah, it's an interesting challenge putting yourself in the heads of these prime ministers. When people ask me about the toils of these books, I say I endured Theresa May's premiership for twice as long as she did.
Oh, well, hopefully not Liz Truss's for twice as long as she did. All Out War, The Full Story of Brexit, was your first in the 4-part sequence. It felt like a minute-by-minute build-up to the EU referendum. It was a bestseller. What prompted you to put pen to paper right at the start of this?
I had a deal with a publisher to do a book on Boris Johnson, which I originally envisaged, as did everybody involved in this, as likely to be published in 2019, when the inevitable leadership election took place between George Osborne and Boris Johnson to succeed David Cameron. Then the referendum happened, and people said, well, someone's got to write a referendum book. Someone had written one on the Scottish referendum, and it was quite good. But I think we all felt writing a referendum book would just be boring. We knew the result. Remain were going to win, blah, blah, blah. Then, of course, Remain didn't win. But I was still writing a book about Boris Johnson, so that would more than be covered by it. And then I was standing at Theresa May's campaign launch for the leadership, which was in the library at the Royal United Services Institute. And as we're standing there at the back, everyone's milling around waiting for this event to start. Journalists are talking to journalists. May's advisors are circulating. There's this kind of sort of atmosphere of expectation, waiting to see what she's got to say for herself. Later the same morning, Boris Johnson was going to do his launch at the St Ermin's Hotel, another great place where spies used to congregate. So this was a big morning. We were all ready for it. And then an email dropped. And it was an email from Michael Gove, Boris Johnson's campaign manager, basically saying, I've withdrawn my support from Boris Johnson. I don't think he's capable of doing the job. And now I'm going to run myself. And it was one of those things where immediately the room was in utter ferment with people saying, have you seen this? Oh, my God. And I just slipped to the back of the room. You get these alcoves of books, and I slid into an alcove of books, and I picked up the telephone to my agent and said, scrap the Johnson book. We've got to do the referendum book now. This is too good. And I was by then the best plugged in journalist, probably with Johnson and with Gove. And I thought, I can tell this story better than anybody else. And within, I think, about 8 minutes, we had a deal to do a referendum book. And I was literally sitting on a new book contract before Theresa May took to the stage to tell us why she ought to be Prime Minister. So that's how it all began. And I thought it'd be one book. And then Theresa May called an election in 2017, and that then became this chaotic thing. So we decided we'd write another one. And then I idly signed a deal to write a third just to finish the story, which I thought would be when Theresa May got her deal through, or I thought would be after she left, or I thought would be after Boris Johnson pushed the deal through. And on it went, with the end just retreating further into the future, quicker than I could catch it up with the interviews I was doing. We had 2 kids along the way as well, which distracted me a little bit. But only now, touch wood, I'm hopeful in the next fortnight that I will have finally caught up with events in the Conservative Party, and there's nothing more they can do now. It will be just my luck that the day we press publish that Boris Johnson announces he's running for a by-election or something. But for now, I'm tantalisingly close to the sort of the hem of events, and I'm nearly there. I've nearly caught them up.
That first book came runner-up in the Orwell Prize for Political Writing, but more interestingly, I thought, became the basis for a film, Brexit, the Uncivil Wars, starring one of my favourite actors. If you've got any links, Tim, that would be handy. Benedict Cumberbatch as Dominic Cummings. And you were a political consultant on that as well, Tim. Was it exciting? Because this is kind of your Heron moment, starting with slow horses on the telly, isn't it? You've got stuff on the big screen.
Yeah, a little bit. Interestingly, the guy who beat me to the Orwell Prize was a guy called John Bew, who wrote a very good biography of Clement Attlee. He's subsequently been in my life for the last few years as the chief foreign policy advisor to Boris Johnson, to Liz Truss and to Rishi Sunak. So the one survivor of all 3 regimes, really. And Bew's, he's kind of an academic, kind of civil service type character doing a political job. But yeah, he never ceases to remind me that he edged it. What happened with the referendum was that James Graham, that brilliant writer of contemporary plays and political dramas, was hired by a production company to write a book on the referendum. And they had bought Craig Oliver's book, who was David Cameron's spin doctor, who wrote a book on the Remain campaign. And the second Graham had his feet under the table, he said, "You bought the wrong book. We need Shipman's book." So they bought my book as well and took me on as a consultant. And to be honest, James Graham is so brilliant. I didn't actually do that much consulting. One of my only jobs really was to engineer a conversation between him and the Vote Leave crew who he wanted to talk to. I wasn't there, but a very boozy dinner with Cummings and all the Vote Leave crew. And then the connection was made through that with Cumberbatch and Cummings. And if people want to look it up, Cummings' wife, Mary Wakefield, wrote a brilliant piece for The Spectator about this dinner at which her husband and Benedict Cumberbatch just began to talk to each other, and Cumberbatch asked lots of questions. And as the meal went on, she gradually began to notice Cumberbatch's accent changing until he too was sporting flat Durham vowels like her husband. And he was mirroring the mannerisms and the arm movements and all the rest of it. And by the end of this dinner, she had two Dominic Cummingses sitting around her table. And that's how Cumberbatch absorbed Cummings. I got to go to set a couple of times, one interior, it was in Hyde Park. There's the meeting, if you've seen that film, between Cummings and the data guy, and that all took place in Hyde Park. I was there for that. So I got to meet Cumberbatch briefly, and more importantly, so did my wife, who accompanied me on that occasion. One of the rare perks is to get your wife in front of people that she fancies, so that's good.
Oh my goodness. Your work's so detailed. She says, trying to spare your wife's blushes right now and move on. When you're writing your books and you're drawing on all this information, do you keep diaries or anything like that to remind you of some perhaps of the conversations you've had, or the nuggets, as I know you call them when you're doing your long form writing in the Sunday Times, the nuggets that you've collected along the way?
It's not terribly secret to suggest that most of the sort of, certainly for the book interviews that I would do, I would tape. So I've got all those tapes. On the day-to-day, you've sometimes got a tape running and sometimes scribbling notes in a notepad. But I also constantly have, anyone who's written a book knows that there's a software called Scrivener, which I use, which is a kind of platform built on top of Microsoft Word, but it allows you to create lots of tabs down your left-hand side of your page, and you can split your screen. So you can have your transcript on one side and what you're writing on the left, and then so every chapter is a tab. Within each chapter, every kind of scene, every nugget, every thought. So I can write things into there straight away, and I can move them around on the left using this Scrivener thing. So if you're scrolling up and down through a vast Word file, it would become almost impossible. But I can jump straight to the point I want to jump to in each book. So when I've got a transcript, or if I'm on the phone to someone and they tell me something interesting, when I finish that call, I think, oh, that bit would be very good in this section of the book. And I can go straight to that section of the book and drop in that thought, or link to, remind myself to listen to that particular tape again. And then in the old days, I would send these tapes out to be transcribed by a bunch of students. These days, you can get a pretty decent version by whacking it through an AI transcription piece of software. It would help me if my newspaper didn't keep saying that these were all created by the Chinese and banning us from using them. Now onto about my fourth different one as a consequence.
Oh no, they're useful for the podcasters as well, actually.
Exactly.
But I can't let you go without asking you about Trump, because you interviewed Donald Trump, didn't you, in the Oval Office? And I just wondered what that experience was like, Tim, what your memories are.
People always say, are you nervous when you're interviewing big politicians? And for the most part in Britain, I'm not. I know most of them reasonably well. Not being nervous is the key. Having a rapport and coaxing them to say things is the key. So being relaxed is important. You plan in advance and you know how long you've got. Interviewing Trump was the most terrifying journalistic experience of my life, not because he was intimidating, but because we just didn't know the setup at all. The way it had been arranged was that I was going to go and do it for the Sunday Times, and Tom Newton-Dunn, who was then the political editor of the Sun, was going to do it for the Sun, and we were basically going to share time. Now, Tom and I are old muckers. We're not like best pals, but we got on well enough that we came up with the sort of areas we wanted to get into, and we agreed that whoever asked whatever question, that we would divvy up the material at the end so that we both got a splash and a spread. But we got there, and you're never quite sure that you're going to actually get the interview. You get into the White House, you sit on a sofa in the lobby foyer, and we sat there for about 2 hours. It was like the Marie Celeste. I've been in the White House several times, and it's normally an absolute bustling in the West Wing TV series, everyone charging about. The Trump White House was a sort of abandoned ship, and Mike Pence, the vice president, strolled past and nodded and went, "You all right?" And then Ivanka Trump went past at some point in this process, wafting seamlessly on what appeared to be a sort of pillow of air that just glided her along, impossibly elegant. But there was hardly anybody else around, and we were just left there. And Tom was an Arsenal fan, and they were playing in a European Cup final at the time, so he's desperately trying to watch this on his phone, and I'm wondering whether we're ever going to get in, and when we do, what it's going to be like. We're finally ushered in. We go into the Oval Office. Trump emerges from the side room where we all know that he's got multiple TV screens, just rolling news where he's watching himself and what everybody's saying about him. And he comes in and he's a big guy. I remember during one of his election campaigns, he was claiming that he was the equivalent of sort of 13 stone. And, well, you're taller than me and fatter than me. You ain't 13 stone, sunshine. If you're under 20, I'd be amazed. You shook hands and you thought, yeah, that's not the biggest hand in the world. Another of the things that Trump is obsessed about. But yeah, big billowing, double-breasted suit, hair flying. Well, actually not. It's sort of solid wedge of hair. And then we sat down and we didn't know how long we had. And 9 minutes in, his finger extends and he presses the red button. And you think, well, either this is an ejector seat because we've said the wrong thing, or the Secret Service are just going to come in and basically say, "Time's up, lads. Thanks very much. Off you go," after 9 minutes. But no, the red button, which is, I think, you'll normally use as a sort of intercom for the president to his personal assistant, not with Trump. Very quickly, a flunky came in with a silver tray with Diet Cokes on it. So this is basically the Diet Coke button. So we all had Diet Cokes and carried on. And Tom and I desperately chucking questions at him and working out what answers we'd got. And we were kind of interrupting each other, trying to get in and trying to move things on. And I asked some questions about the Meghan Markle, who she then was, which got good answers. We had some stuff on Farage, on Boris, on all the kind of usual suspect subjects with Trump. And you're sort of sitting there. Part of you is just staring at his hair because his hair is quite astonishing. He's clearly absolutely bald as a coot in the middle, but he allows his hair to be grown very long and then it's kind of wrapped around his head and sprayed into place to cover up what is clearly, a football-sized bald patch. And it's got that sort of consistency of spun sugar on a cake. And you're just staring at it and it doesn't really move, but you can kind of see through it. So you can sort of see pink scalp. And you're looking at his eyes where the rims, as the cartoonists noticed early on, around the eyes, he's orange, but his eyes are white because he's clearly been wearing goggles when he puts himself in the artificial sunbed. And you're noticing all these things while desperately trying to listen to what he's saying and knowing that this is kind of a once-in-a-lifetime moment for you. But the thing with him is he answers the questions and he knows where you're going and he knows what will cause the most trouble and the most mischief, and he gives you those answers. So on the one hand, you're terrified it's all about to be over. On the other hand, you're sort of thinking, this is the most frank interview that I've had with a politician in a very long time. And then on the other, you're sort of, as a Brit, mildly disgusted that he's prepared to be so rude about the British Prime Minister, who was May at the time, and quite so praiseworthy of her mortal enemies. But you're just sort of thinking this is an astonishing performance. And while a lot of it's just sort of feral and instinctual, he does deep down know exactly what he's doing. And while the tactical stuff, the specifics of what he says are dreamt up on the most flimsy spur of the moment, sort of gut response of this is how I'm going to play it is very well thought out by Trump. And you see that throughout with everything he's done, good and bad, that there's just a sort of urge to power that he has and a willingness to say what he thinks with no filter. And while that can be a nightmare for democracy, it's kind of quite helpful for journalists.
What an incredible experience. I am going to wrap now, Tim, just with a final question about risk. We have asked everybody in this season what the biggest risk they've ever taken. I would imagine you might have quite a good choice, actually.
Well, I'm sure there are risks you take with your safety when you're going off on trips. But the one I think of will seem so minor now and rather pathetic. But the biggest journalistic risk I ever took was the weekend in December 2018 when Theresa May was supposed to be holding the meaningful vote, the first one on her Brexit deal. And things were not looking good. She was on course to lose quite heavily. And I got wind that Saturday. The vote was supposed to be, I think, on the Tuesday. And I got wind that this vote wasn't going to happen and she was going to pull it. I got this initially from someone whose judgment I trust, who said this is fairly certain where this is going to end up. I then spoke to somebody else in number 10 who said, I think that's right, but if you write it, you'll look wrong for 48 hours. because the line will remain the same, which is that the vote is going ahead, and that will not change before Tuesday. So you've got to kind of take your life in your hands a bit with this one. And it's so unimportant whether this vote was held or when it was held or whatever. But at the time, it was the thing that everybody cared about. And my rival, Glenn Owen at the Mail on Sunday, had interviewed the Prime Minister that weekend, who had insisted the vote was going ahead. He'd heard the same rumours as me, but he couldn't write them because he had the Prime Minister contradicting them on the record in his own newspaper. I phoned a third person who said, yeah, it's happening, but up to you, son. And I basically thought, nothing ventured, nothing gained. And I wrote this in a little bit of a couched way. And then the editor stuck a headline on it that allowed no couching. It was, vote will be called off. And I'm like, oh, this is a bit painful. And on the Sunday morning, someone went on the telly and said this was nonsense and the thing was going to go ahead. And I messaged one of my sources and said, I told you the line was going to stay the same. Everybody was making a sort of monkey of me and telling me I was wrong. I think it was either the Monday or the Tuesday morning. Michael Gove was on the Today programme saying the vote was definitely going to go ahead. That was at 9 o'clock in the morning. At 11 o'clock, they pulled the vote. And suddenly everyone who'd been slagging me off over the weekend said, this is death or glory journalism of the finest sort. I knew it was going to be a sort of lonely weekend, and it was, but I was quite relieved when it came in, as I had expected it to. And then, of course, Glenn was furious because he was like, well, I couldn't write the story and I wanted to write the story as well. But there we go. It seems so minor, but when you've built a reputation for accuracy, I don't take too many risks now. I'm the old bloke saying X probably won't happen rather than the young person getting excited that it might. For a long time, I was the person in my office saying, they're not going to call the election early. And I knew that was the view of the campaign director. And in the end, the campaign director was overruled by Rishi Sunak. But yeah, for the most part, if I'm too much in doubt about something, I would rather be correct than rush out and be first these days. That's not a luxury everybody has before they've kind of built up their reputation. But I had by then built up my reputation. And that would have been a bit of a zinger if I'd got it wrong. But yeah.
It would have been a zinger, and you have built up a rather fine reputation, if I may say. It is great, Tim, to finally meet you, having read and enjoyed a lot of your work. And who knows, perhaps calmer waters ahead, but politics, I presume, will always remain important and interesting, hey?
Yeah, I've been extremely fortunate. I joke that I've never really done a proper day's work. That's sort of nonsense because I absolutely break myself to service the paper and finish the book and do the right thing by my family. But it's a great privilege to sort of have a ringside seat at these things. And I guess the problem is sometimes you feel your views as a citizen contradicting those as a journalist. As a citizen, you'd be pretty dismayed about what's happened over the last 8 years. As a journalist, in one of the books, I quote Alistair Cook, who was a great hero of mine, the great BBC Letter from America journalist. He found himself in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel, literally seconds after Bobby Kennedy was assassinated in 1968. And he wrote this very moving thing about what he saw there. And some of those words are very powerful. I think he referred to looking down at Kennedy's face and seeing the stone cold face of a child on a tomb. And it kind of puts a shiver up your back thinking of that. But the thing that's always stuck in my mind, even more than that, was what he wrote about being there. And he said, I cannot honestly say, as I would like to say, that I wish I hadn't been there. And I feel a little bit like that over the last 8 years. This may have been a disaster for the country, but my God, these were the glory days for political journalism. And I've been extremely honoured to have been in the middle of it all and trusted by so many people with their thoughts and feelings about it. And that's kind of how I reflect. But I think it will be good for everybody if we can have a period of slightly more calm now.
Yeah, you're so right. It's a privilege. As a journalist, I say the same thing, that I don't feel like I've worked a day in my life. And obviously, I've worked very hard since I was 17, but it is a privilege to have a ringside seat at world events. And you've delivered the insight to that very well over a very long time, Tim. And I'd love to buy you a glass of red at some point when life calms down for you.
It's a deal.
It's a deal. You've been listening to Political Insider and Chief Political Commentator of the Sunday Times, Tim Shipman, giving his assessment of the first couple of weeks of our new government under Prime Minister Keir Starmer. And I highly recommend Tim's books, the latest of which has just been released. The titles are all very similar and a bit confusing, but is out in September. I've had to make sure I've got all of those right. Download our podcast at convex.podbean.com or search The Convex Conversation on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to yours. I'll be back next week with the creator of Downton Abbey and producer of some of our favourite TV dramas, including Spooks. So Tim will like that one. So join me then.